There is a moment inside every royal palace when the cameras are gone, the curtains are drawn, and the people who wear crowns become simply people. No protocol, no rehearsed smiles, no carefully worded statements from press secretaries. Just two human beings, alone inside marble walls, carrying the weight of a decision that the world would soon tear apart. That moment came for King Charles III and Camilla, Queen Consort, in the early months of 2024. And what happened behind those palace doors, between a king trying to hold his dynasty together and a woman quietly breaking inside, is a story that no royal biographer fully captured, no tabloid headline completely told, and no official statement ever dared admit. This is not a story about titles. This is not a story about crowns or protocols or public appearances scheduled on a palace calendar. This is a story about what happens when a man, a father, a husband, a king, finally decides to cut the last thread connecting him to a son he once held as a boy, and what it costs the woman standing beside him when he does. Pay close attention, because this story begins not with a dramatic announcement, not with a press release, not with a leaked letter. It begins with a silence. The kind of silence that only comes after something irreversible has been decided. The kind that fills a room so completely that even the people inside it stop breathing for a moment. The kind of silence that means, it is done. The palace in the early morning carries a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of institution, of stone corridors that have absorbed centuries of grief and ceremony in equal measure, of rooms where decisions were made that changed the course of nations, of portraits on walls whose subjects long ago stopped caring about the consequences of the choices they once made. It is a stillness that does not comfort. It simply endures. King Charles III had been awake since before the light came. This was not unusual. He had always been an early riser, a man who preferred the honest gray of early morning to the theatrics of midday, who took his tea alone before the palace machinery began its daily hum. But on this particular morning, a morning in the deep winter of 2024, when the grounds of Sandringham lay frostbitten and quiet outside his window, the king was not sitting in comfortable contemplation. He was sitting with a decision already made, already settled in his chest like something calcified, and he was simply waiting for the world to wake up so it could begin. The decision involved his son Harry, but to call it simply a decision about Harry was to misunderstand everything that had brought them to this point. It was a decision about the monarchy itself, about what the institution could absorb and what it could not, about the difference between a father's love and a king's duty, and about the brutal reality that in the life Charles had chosen, those two things had rarely been the same. The fracture between Charles and his younger son had not begun with a single argument or a single betrayal. It had grown slowly, the way damage to something old always grows, invisibly at first, then suddenly visible everywhere at once. It had begun with Harry and Meghan's decision to step back from royal duties in January 2020, a moment that caught the family off guard in a way that none of them had quite recovered from. It had grown deeper through the opera interview of March 2021, when allegations were made on international television that wounded the palace in ways that press secretaries could paper over publicly, but could not actually heal. And it had continued to widen through the Netflix documentary, through Harry's memoir Spare, published in January 2023, through revelations that the family had read about themselves in newspapers before they heard them from Harry directly. By the winter of 2024, what remained between Charles and his son was not warmth. It was the memory of warmth, the ghost of something that had once been real, now present only in the way an old injury aches when the weather changes. Charles still loved Harry. There was no version of this story in which a father simply stops loving a child, no matter what the protocol demands or what the headlines suggest. But love, Charles had learned across a lifetime of being royal, was not always enough. Sometimes love was precisely the thing that made a hard decision harder without making it wrong. The decision that had crystallized in those early winter weeks was about formalization. It was about the official severing of what threads remained connecting Harry, the Duke of Sussex, living in Montecito, California, with his wife and children, to the working structure of the British monarchy. It was about making permanent what had already, in every practical sense, become true. Harry was not coming back. The reconciliation that various well-meaning intermediaries had quietly attempted to engineer over the preceding years had not materialized. The public overtures that had been floated, the private conversations that various aides and family members had attempted. None of it had produced the kind of resolution that would have allowed things to be any different. And so Charles, being a king above all other things, had made the decision that kings make when sentiment and practicality no longer point in the same direction. He had chosen clarity. He had chosen the institution over the relationship. He had signed off, in effect, on the understanding that whatever existed between him and Harry now would exist outside the structure of the monarchy entirely. That Harry's path and the crown's path would no longer even run parallel to each other, much less intersect. What he had perhaps not fully accounted for, not because he was unfeeling, but because the architecture of royal decision-making does not easily accommodate it, was what this would mean for Camilla. Camilla Parker Bowles had waited longer than almost anyone to arrive at the place she now occupied. She had endured decades of public hatred, of tabloid cruelty that occasionally bordered on the inhuman, of being cast as the villain in the story of a princess that the whole world had fallen in love with. She had been called names in print that would make a person wince to repeat. She had watched herself become a symbol of everything people wanted to blame for a marriage that had been troubled long before she was ever a factor in it. And she had borne it, quietly, with a kind of stoic English patience, and with the private confidence of a woman who understood that the man she loved loved her in return, and that time, if nothing else, had a way of rearranging reputations. By 2024, Camilla was queen consort. She had stood beside Charles at his coronation in May 2023 in Westminster Abbey, under the weight of history and the eyes of the world, and she had been crowned. It was a moment that would have seemed impossible to the woman she had been 20 years earlier, to the woman who had sat in cars with blacked-out windows and entered buildings through side doors to avoid the flash of cameras. She had arrived. She had, by every institutional measure, won. But winning had not made her immune to feeling. And the situation with Harry, the particular shape of the wound it represented, was one that Camilla experienced differently from Charles, in ways that she was careful not to impose on him, but that she also could not pretend away. Camilla understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the palace, the cost of family estrangement. She had lived through her own share of complicated family dynamics, had watched relationships bend and sometimes break under the pressure of public scrutiny and private pain. She knew what it looked like when people who had once been close to each other stopped being able to find their way back. She knew it in the way that people who have lived long enough always know it, not academically, but in the body, in the chest, in the particular weight of certain silences. And she knew Charles. She knew him in the way that only a person who has loved someone across 40 years of complicated, interrupted, sometimes impossible circumstances can know another person. She knew when he was carrying something he was not saying. She knew the particular set of his shoulders when a decision had already been made, and he was simply working out how to carry it forward. She knew the difference between Charles the man and Charles the king, and she knew, had always known, that when those two versions of him came into conflict, the king was the one who won. He had told her, of course, this was not the kind of decision made in isolation. They had talked about it across several evenings, in the private sitting room they shared at Sandringham, with the fire going and the dogs at their feet and the external world reduced, briefly, to something manageable. He had told her what he was planning. He had explained his reasoning, careful, considered, the reasoning of a man who had thought about little else for months. He had listened to her response, had taken it in with the genuine attention he always gave her, had absorbed her concerns and reflected on them. And then he had done what he had always done, across a lifetime of being heir to the throne and now king of it. He had made the decision that the institution required, and he had made peace with it, or something that looked enough like peace from the outside that the distinction barely mattered. Camilla had not made the same peace, not yet, not fully. She supported him. This needs to be said clearly because the easy narrative, the one that reduces her to a passive figure, a woman without agency, a queen consort who simply stood to one side while the real decisions were made, is not the truth. She supported Charles in the way that a partner who truly understands another person's burden supports them, not by pretending the burden doesn't exist, not by offering false reassurance, but by standing alongside it, by not flinching, by being there when the day ended and there was no more performance required, and what remained was simply the two of them, alone in a room that history would never know existed. But support was not the same as not feeling the weight of what was being done. And Camilla, who was warm in ways the public rarely saw, who was funny in ways that surprised people who expected her to be severe, who had a genuine emotional intelligence that the palace machinery often obscured, felt it. She felt it in the way that anyone feels the consequence of an action that cannot be undone. She felt it not as a judgment on Charles, not as a disagreement with his decision, but as grief, the particular kind of grief that settles over a person when something is ending and there is nothing left to do about it. The palace in those days had a quality to it that the staff noticed without necessarily being able to name. There was a formality to the routines that was not unusual. Royal life is nothing if not formal, but there was something underneath it, something in the quality of the quiet that fell between certain rooms, in the careful way that aides spoke and moved, in the particular attentiveness of the household staff to the moods of the people they served. Something had shifted. Something significant was happening, and even those who did not know the specifics of it could feel it in the way that people who work in close proximity to power always feel such things, in the atmosphere, in the unspoken, in the texture of days. Charles moved through this period with the particular kind of resolution that characterized him at his most kingly. He was focused, controlled, deliberate in his engagements. He fulfilled his public duties with the precision of a man who has been training for this position his entire life and who, when the weight of that position bears down most heavily, finds in routine and duty something that functions, if not as comfort, then as structure. He was photographed at engagements smiling. He was photographed looking well. The cameras caught him as he wanted to be caught, as a king managing his responsibilities with dignity and composure. What the cameras did not catch, what they could not catch by definition, was the man who returned to the private quarters at the end of those days, who set down the weight of the public performance and sat, sometimes, for long minutes without speaking, who accepted Camilla's presence beside him not as a comfort exactly, but as a necessity, the way a person who is carrying something very heavy will sometimes lean, just slightly, against whatever is nearest, not because they intend to transfer the weight, but because leaning is the only acknowledgement they are willing to make that the weight exists at all. Camilla understood this. She understood it without needing it explained. She had spent 40 years learning the particular grammar of Charles's silences, and she read this one correctly. He did not want to be comforted. He did not want to be reassured. He wanted to be witnessed. He wanted to know that someone who understood the full complexity of what he had done, who understood both its necessity and its cost, was present with him in the carrying of it. She was present. She remained present. And in the privacy of rooms that no journalist would ever enter and no biographer would ever fully reconstruct, she was also in the quiet spaces between her own careful composure, quietly breaking. Not because she disagreed, not because she thought Charles was wrong, but because she understood something about this kind of severance that Charles, for all his careful reasoning, had perhaps not fully allowed himself to feel, that it is never just a decision. It is always also a loss, that the moment a relationship is formally ended, even one that has already functionally ended, even one that both parties have already lived beyond in every practical sense, that moment carries with it a finality that no amount of institutional reasoning can soften. Something that was once possible becomes impossible. A door closes that will not open again in the same way if it opens at all. And Camilla, who knew more than most about the particular agony of closed doors, who had spent years waiting outside them, understood that what Charles was doing, however right and however necessary, meant that Harry was now on the other side of a door that neither of them would easily be able to find the handle of again. She understood it in her chest. She understood it in the way she watched Charles when he didn't know she was watching. She understood it in the quality of her own silence, in the conversations she didn't have, in the things she chose not to say to spare him the added weight of knowing how much the weight was also pressing on her. Outside, the frostbitten grounds of Sandringham continued their winter quiet. The world continued its orbits. The press would eventually get fragments, they always did, and those fragments would be shaped into stories that bore some relationship to the truth without ever fully being it. Headlines would appear. Commentators would offer their analyses. The public would form opinions, passionately, as it always did about the royal family, as though proximity to the story gave them ownership of its meaning. None of them would know what it looked like inside the palace in those early mornings. None of them would know the shape of the silence. None of them would know about the woman sitting near a fire in a private room, watching a man she had loved across 4 difficult and beautiful decades make a decision that was tearing something in him that he would not let anyone see, and tearing something in her that she had not found words for yet, and was not sure she ever would. The decision had been made. That was the fact of it. The king had spoken not to the world yet, but to himself, and when a king speaks to himself with that particular finality, the rest is merely a matter of time and sequence. The formal world would catch up. The announcements would follow. The mechanisms of monarchy would turn, as they always turned, slowly and with great weight and without much visible mercy. But first, before any of that, there was this. The morning, the frost, the fire in the private room, the two people inside it who had been through almost everything together and were now navigating something that neither of them had a map for. The man who had made his peace with a decision, and the woman who loved him too completely to tell him that she had not made hers yet. That she was still in the deep and quiet center of herself, somewhere between understanding and grief, holding both at once. The way you hold things when you love someone whose choices you will always choose to stand beside, even when those choices cost you something you did not know you had left to lose. There is a particular cruelty to being a public person in private pain. It is not the cruelty of anyone's intention. It is simply the geometry of a life lived partly in view. Every smile photographed in the wrong moment becomes evidence of callousness. Every moment of composure gets read as indifference. The distance between what is actually happening inside a person and what the world believes is happening grows wider and more unbridgeable the more famous that person becomes, until eventually the public version of them is not a simplification of the truth, but a different creature entirely, something that shares a name and a face with the real person, but has almost nothing else in common with them. Camilla had lived this reality for so long that she had developed a kind of careful internal architecture around it. She knew how to be present in a room without being legible to it. She knew how to give a crowd the warmth they needed without giving them access to anything real. She had learned, across decades of being one of the most scrutinized and frequently despised women in Britain, that the difference between surviving public life and being destroyed by it was the maintenance of an interior space that remained genuinely private. A place inside yourself that the cameras could not reach, that the headlines could not colonize, that remained yours alone no matter how much of the rest of you became public property. In the weeks following Charles's decision, Camilla maintained that interior space with the precision of long practice. To the outside world, she appeared exactly as a queen consort was supposed to appear. She attended her engagements. She smiled at the right moments. She spoke with the warmth that had in recent years begun to soften a public image that had once been so unfavorable as to seem permanently fixed. She was photographed looking composed, elegant, appropriately regal. The machine of royal appearance continued its steady rotation, and she was a part of it, as she had committed to being, as she had vowed to be when she chose this life fully and finally. But inside the palace, in the rooms that photographers could not enter, in the hours that did not make it onto any schedule, something else was unfolding. A process that had no official name, no protocol to govern it, no precedent in the royal handbooks. A process that was simply, in the most human terms possible, the process of a woman coming to terms with something that her heart had not finished processing even when her mind had already accepted it. The thing about Camilla that is most often missed in the tabloid portrayals, in the hostile commentaries, in the more sympathetic accounts that still tend to flatten her into a symbol rather than a person, is that she is someone for whom family has always mattered enormously. This is not a contradiction of her reputation. It does not require you to revise your understanding of her history or to adopt any particular position on the complicated events of her past. It is simply a fact about her as a person, observable across the arc of her life. She is someone who cares deeply about family, who has worked hard to build and maintain family connections across what has been, by any honest assessment, an unusually difficult personal history. She had worked to build a relationship with William and Harry from early in their acquaintance, in the years when Charles had begun to introduce her more formally into his life. It had not been easy. How could it have been easy? She was, in the eyes of two grieving sons, connected to the breakdown of their parents' marriage, connected, in the most devastating possible way, to the absence of their mother. The emotional mathematics of that situation were impossibly complex, and no amount of goodwill on anyone's part could make them simple. But Camilla had tried. She had been careful and patient, and had maintained a respectful distance when distance was what was needed, and had offered warmth when warmth seemed possible, and had by most accounts from people close to the family managed over time to build something with both of them that was genuine, if never entirely uncomplicated. With William, that relationship had stabilized into something that functioned. There were still the inevitable tensions of royal family dynamics, still the complexities that any extended royal family carries simply by virtue of the pressures it lives under, but the fundamental relationship had reached a workable equilibrium. William was his father's heir. He was preparing to be king. He understood, as someone raised to understand, the demands of the institution, the necessity of continuity, the importance of presenting a coherent and stable face to the world. He and Camilla shared, among other things, the project of supporting Charles through the early years of his kingship, and that shared project had given their relationship a kind of working foundation. With Harry, it had never reached that equilibrium. The particular pain of Harry's situation, the pain of a second son, of someone who felt perpetually overlooked, and then, in his own telling, actively unsupported and endangered by the institution he was born into, had created dynamics that no amount of patience and goodwill could fully resolve. The opera interview, the memoir, the documentary, each of these had torn at the fabric of what relationship existed, until what remained was something that could barely be called a relationship at all. And yet Camilla, even as she supported Charles's decision, even as she stood with him in the weight of it, carried her own particular grief about Harry. Not a grief she broadcast, not a grief that made its way into any statement or any public forum, but a private grief, specific and textured in the way that private griefs always are, made of particular memories, particular moments, particular glimpses of who Harry had been before everything had become so fractured and irreparable. She remembered a young man who had been, in his best moments, enormously charming, who had his mother's warmth and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and who had deployed both in ways that were sometimes exasperating and sometimes genuinely wonderful, who had made people in rooms laugh without trying, who had a quality of aliveness to him, a brightness that had always been very hard to look at directly, because it reminded people too forcefully of Diana, and reminding people of Diana was never a straightforward experience for anyone in that family, least of all for Camilla. She was not naive about what Harry had done, or what the consequences of those actions had been. She held no illusions about the damage that had been caused, about the real pain that certain revelations had inflicted on real people, about the way in which the Harry and Meghan situation had made the palace's job, an already extraordinarily difficult job, exponentially harder. She understood Charles's reasoning with complete clarity. She agreed with his reasoning, in the part of her that thought analytically about the institution and its needs. But there was another part of her, the part that was not a queen consort or an institutional actor, but simply a woman who had been paying attention to this family for a very long time, and that part ached for what had been lost. Ached, not with anger, but with the particular sorrow of waste, of what might have been different, of the version of this story that did not end with formal severance and permanent distance and a wound that would never fully close. There were conversations she had with Charles during this period that he would not forget, because they were different from his conversations with his advisors, different from the discussions in which he and his aides had carefully mapped out the institutional implications and procedural necessities of what he was doing. These were conversations that happened late, in the private rooms, when the day's performing was over and both of them had relaxed into themselves. Conversations that did not follow any agenda. That circled, sometimes, around the same territory without landing anywhere definitive, not because they lacked conclusions, but because the territory was painful enough that neither of them wanted to press too hard into it. Camilla would ask about Harry's children sometimes, about Archie and Lilibet, two small people who had been born into a family situation they had no part in creating, and who would grow up, for whatever reasons, at a considerable distance from the grandfather who wore the crown of their country. She would ask about them gently, not as an accusation or a challenge to the decision Charles had made, but as a way of acknowledging that the decision had human dimensions that the institutional calculus did not fully capture. Children were growing up. A grandfather was aging. Time moved in one direction only, and some of what was being spent now would not be available again. Charles heard these questions. He always heard them. He was not a man who made important decisions without also sitting with their full cost. He was more emotionally complex than people who only saw the formal, institutional version of him often appreciated. He carried the weight of it. He carried the particular weight of being a grandfather who had made a decision that made regular contact with two of his grandchildren extremely unlikely, and he carried it in the particular way that reserved, emotionally guarded English men carry such things. Quietly, internally, with a kind of careful management that looked from the outside like equanimity, but was, from the inside, something quite different. The palace had its rhythms, and life inside it continued in those rhythms even as the private drama of the family unfolded around and beneath them. Staff moved through their routines. Meetings were held, correspondence was managed. The machinery of monarchy, which had survived catastrophes far larger than family estrangements, continued its patient, ancient operation. But beneath that surface, in the household's most private corners, there was a quality of weight that experienced palace staff, people who had served across multiple monarchs, and who had developed over decades an almost clinical sensitivity to the emotional weather of the institution, recognized as significant. This was not the weight of a normal difficult period, the kind that came and went with public controversies or logistical challenges. This was something deeper. Something that had the quality of permanence to it. Something that was settling into the foundations of the family story, rather than simply passing through. Outside, in the world that monitors the British royal family with an intensity that would be exhausting to describe, and that the royals themselves have long since stopped trying to fully process, the discussion about Charles and Harry continued on its own terms. Commentators offered analyses. Former royal correspondents shared their interpretations. People who had never been inside a palace and had no particular access to anyone who had spoke with great confidence about what was happening and why and what it meant. Social media amplified every fragment of real information to the point where the fragments became impossible to distinguish from speculation, and speculation became impossible to distinguish from fact. In California, Harry and Meghan continued their lives, their foundation, their projects, their carefully managed public presence in a country that regarded them with far less of the historical emotional weight that Britain carried into every encounter with them. Harry gave occasional interviews. Meghan launched ventures. The distance between Montecito and whatever remained of a working relationship with the British Crown continued to assert itself in practical ways, as distances always do, through the accumulation of ordinary time passing during which contact does not occur, through decisions made independently on each side that gradually make the positions of each party less and less compatible with the positions of the other. Camilla, watching all of this from inside the institution that sat at one end of this distance, understood that the world was telling itself a story about what was happening. She understood that she was a character in that story, sometimes a villain, sometimes a sympathetic figure depending on the outlet and the day, often a somewhat peripheral character to whom the drama happened rather than one who shaped it. She understood this, and she did not particularly fight it. She had stopped fighting the stories the world told about her a long time ago. What the world decided to believe about her was largely outside her control, and she had made her peace, real peace, the earned kind, the kind that comes from years of practice, with that fact. What she had not made peace with, what she was still, in those private rooms in those private weeks, actively processing, was the internal version of events, the version that was only visible to her. The version that was made of small, specific things, the memory of a family that had been, for brief moments in its most private configurations, something that looked almost like ordinary. The memory of what it had felt like to imagine that the fractures were fixable, that the distance was temporary, that the complicated love that existed between a father and his sons would eventually find a way through the obstacle course of royal life and institutional pressure and public pain and personal grievance. That imagination was now definitively over. Charles's decision had ended it, not cruelly, not carelessly, but with the particular kind of finality that comes when a person of good judgment makes a decision they have been carefully avoiding for a long time and finally commits to it fully. It was the right decision, or at least as close to right as any decision in an impossible situation could be. Camilla believed that. She continued to believe it. She also continued to feel, in the places where she kept the things she felt most carefully, the texture of what the decision cost. Not the institutional cost. She understood that in broad strokes and accepted it. The human cost. The cost measured not in headlines or policy positions or public statements, but in the simple and irreducible currency of relationships that were no longer available. of a family configuration that had been troubled and complicated and sometimes actively painful, but had also, in its best moments, been real. And that was now being exchanged for something cleaner, clearer, and fundamentally lonelier. She did not say this to Charles in so many words. She knew him well enough to know that saying it directly would not serve either of them, would not change anything, would not help him carry what he was already carrying, would only add to the weight she could see him managing so carefully. She was not in the business of burdening the man she loved with sorrows she had not been able to fully resolve herself. That was not how she loved him, and it was not how their relationship worked. What she did instead was what she had always done in the hardest moments of their life together. She stayed. She was present. She was warm in the specific ways that only someone who has loved a person for a very long time can be warm, not performing warmth, not deploying it strategically, but simply having it, genuinely and without condition, available to him in the rooms where no one else could see. She was the one constant in a situation where almost everything was shifting. And in the particular mathematics of royal life, where the constant things are almost always more important than the changing ones, that constancy was everything. The palace held them both in its ancient, indifferent way, held them in stone and history and the accumulated weight of centuries of similar human drama playing out in similar rooms. It did not judge. It did not offer comfort. It simply endured, as it had always endured, and would continue to endure long after the specific human drama of this moment had passed into the history that the future would eventually summarize and simplify and misunderstand in the ways that history always does. The final tie was being broken, slowly with great deliberateness and with full awareness of what it meant. A king was doing what kings do, and a queen consort was doing what she had spent her life learning to do, bearing what needed to be borne, holding what needed to be held, and keeping private in the deep interior space that was hers alone the full weight of what this cost her. She was breaking in that space, quietly, completely, and without letting it show. Every ending has an aftermath. This is the part that does not make the headlines, not because it is less important, but because it is less legible. The dramatic moment, the formal severance, the decision that cracks the air like a struck bell, these are the things that the world can see. They happen at a speed and with a sharpness that cameras and journalists can capture. They produce images, quotes, statements, official communiques. They are the surface of the story, visible and photogenic and endlessly discussable. The aftermath is different. The aftermath is the long, slow process of living with what has been done. It does not produce dramatic images. It does not generate quotable moments. It unfolds across ordinary days, across mornings and meals, and the small, repetitive routines that make up the substance of any life, no matter how royal or how ordinary. It unfolds in the body, in the habits of mind, in the particular way that a person begins to navigate a changed landscape after something significant has altered the terrain. For King Charles III and Camilla, the aftermath began not in a palace sitting room or a formal meeting or any choreographed moment of institutional significance. It began, as most real human aftermath does, in the unremarkable continuation of daily life. Charles went to his desk. Camilla went to her engagements. The palace continued its machinery. And somewhere underneath all of that, in the quiet interior of each of them, the process of adjustment began, the slow and often unconscious work of incorporating a change into the fabric of who you are, and how you understand the life you are living. Charles, in the weeks that followed the crystallization of his decision, moved with the kind of purpose that characterized him at his most resolved. He had not made this decision impulsively. There was nothing impulsive about the man, which was both one of his greatest strengths and occasionally a source of frustration to those around him. And he had not made it without having already done a considerable amount of the internal work required to live with it. He had thought it through in the way that he thought everything through, thoroughly, from multiple angles, with a deep and genuine engagement with the ethical dimensions of what he was doing. And he had arrived, by the time the decision was made, at a place that was not comfort exactly, but was something like settled conviction. He believed he was right, and believing he was right gave him the capacity to move forward. He moved forward through his public duties with a presence that those around him noticed was, if anything, more focused than it had been in the preceding difficult months. There was a quality of commitment to his work in this period that spoke of someone who had resolved something within himself and was now channeling the energy that had previously been consumed by unresolved tension into the work that was available to him. He was attentive in his meetings. He was engaged in his briefings. He was present in his public appearances in a way that was slightly different from the composed performance of presence that royals learn as a professional skill. It was more grounded, more centered, the presence of someone who knows where he stands rather than someone who is managing the appearance of knowing. The question of Harry in practical terms had not gone away simply because a decision had been made. Decisions about royal family structures carry bureaucratic weight, legal dimensions, considerations of titles and funding and security arrangements, and all the complicated machinery that the monarchy had accumulated across centuries of managing such situations. The aides worked through these things with the careful professionalism they brought to everything. Papers were drafted, reviewed, revised. Discussions happened at the levels where discussions of this kind happened. And gradually, step by step, the institutional consequences of the decision worked their way through the system and began to be implemented. None of this was public in any direct sense. The palace does not typically hold press conferences to announce the internal management of family structures. But the informed royal correspondents picked up signals, as they always did, and fragments of the larger picture began appearing in print and online, partial, sometimes inaccurate, but collectively pointing in a direction that the more careful observers recognized. Something was being formalized. Something that had been ambiguous was being made clear. The British monarchy's relationship with its exiled duke was being redefined, and the redefinition was not in the direction of greater closeness. The public reaction, when it came, was predictable in its unpredictability. Those who had been most critical of Harry and Meghan expressed satisfaction, or something masquerading as it. Those who were most sympathetic to Harry and Meghan expressed outrage, or something masquerading as it. The commentariat divided along its familiar fault lines. Social media generated its familiar heat. Columnists who had been writing the same column about this family for years wrote it again, with updated specific references but identical structural bones. And the palace, as it always did, as it had done for hundreds of years, absorbed all of this without publicly acknowledging it, without responding to the noise, without allowing the noise to alter the speed or direction of its internal operations. Inside the palace, Camilla watched this external drama with the particular kind of calm attention that came from having been, for most of her adult life, someone that external dramas were about. She had developed a relationship with the public version of her own story that was neither indifferent nor wounded, but something in between. A kind of measured awareness that the story being told out there had certain relationships to the truth without being the truth, and that getting too invested in the distance between the two was a path toward a particular kind of madness that she had learned, through hard experience, to avoid. What she was more invested in, what occupied her in the private portions of those days, was watching Charles. Not monitoring him, not managing him, but simply watching him in the way that a person who loves someone watches them, with attention and care and the particular willingness to see what is actually there, rather than what would be more convenient or comfortable to see. What she saw was a man who was managing well, and was also, underneath the management, carrying something that was heavier than he would ever directly acknowledge. Charles was not someone who processed grief in an obvious or accessible way. This had been true his whole life, documented enough that it was not a controversial observation. He processed it through action, through purpose, through the forward motion of work and duty. He processed it by doing things rather than feeling them, which is not the same as not feeling them. It is a different relationship to feeling, one that has costs and benefits both, and that produces a particular kind of person who is capable of enormous functional effectiveness in difficult circumstances, and who also, inevitably, has a backlog of unprocessed things that accumulates over time. Camilla understood this about him. She had always understood it from early in their relationship, and it was one of the reasons she had always been, in her particular way, indispensable to him. She was one of the few people in his life who could see the backlog without requiring him to address it directly, who could acknowledge it simply by being present, simply by not pretending it wasn't there, simply by offering the companionship of someone who sees you fully and loves you anyway. This was not a small thing. In a life as formally mediated as Charles's, in a world where almost every relationship was shaped by hierarchy and expectation, and the particular distorting pressures of proximity to power, a person who simply saw you and stayed was an extraordinary rarity. He had found one, and in these difficult weeks, her constancy was the thing that made the days navigable. There was an evening, one evening in particular, though there were others like it, that those who knew them best would recognize as characteristic of their relationship in its most essential form. The day had been long. Charles had come back from a full schedule of public engagements, the kind of day that required enormous sustained performance, the constant projection of ease and confidence and warmth, the management of a dozen different rooms and 100 different people, all of whom wanted something from him, even if what they wanted was simply the experience of having been in his presence. He came back from such days depleted in the particular way that performing people are depleted, not physically exhausted so much as hollowed, as though the sustained outward projection of self has temporarily emptied out the interior. Camilla was there. She had had her own day, her own engagements, her own sustained performances, her own 100 rooms and 100 people. She was there anyway. They sat together in the private room, the one with the fire, the one with the dogs, the one that the world would never see, and for a long time neither of them said very much. They did not need to say much. They had reached across 4 decades of knowing each other, the stage of relationship where the most important communication happens in a register that has very little to do with words. What passed between them in that silence was not trivial. It was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people with too much to say, and the wisdom, hard one, to know that some of it was better left in silence. The decision about Harry was in the room with them. Of course it was. It was always in the room with them in those weeks. But it was present not as an unresolved argument or an open wound, but simply as a fact, the way very significant facts eventually settle into facts rather than remaining events. Something had been decided. Something had been lost. They both knew it. They were sitting together in the knowledge of it, and that was, for the moment, enough. Camilla thought in the kind of half-formed way that thoughts arrive in the mind in moments of quiet about time, about how much of it had passed, about the version of herself that had existed 20 years ago, the woman who had been so uncertain about her position in Charles's life, so uncertain about whether any of this would ever resolve into something stable and livable. That woman had been afraid often. She had been exhausted. She had been ground down at moments by the relentlessness of the public judgment and the personal complexity and the sheer difficulty of the situation she was in. And she had kept going anyway. She had chosen, again and again, to keep going. And what had resulted from that choice was this. This fire, this room, this man beside her, this life, complicated and costly and imperfect and genuinely, deeply hers. She did not romanticize the present moment. She was not a woman given to romanticizing. She was too practical for that, too English, too well acquainted with the gap between what things look like from the outside and what they actually are from within. But she recognized, in the midst of the grief and the difficulty and the ongoing weight of living with a decision that was both right and painful, that she was also, in the most fundamental sense, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not in any mystical sense. She was not given to that kind of thinking either. Simply in the practical sense that she had made choices across a long life, and those choices had brought her here, and she did not, in the accounting of it, wish the choices undone. Charles, beside her, was thinking his own thoughts in his own way. He was thinking, and this was something he returned to periodically, in the way that a mind returns to an unresolved question not because it expects to find a new answer, but because it has not yet fully made peace with the old one, about his sons. About the particular experience of having 2 sons whose lives had diverged so completely from each other, and from anything he had imagined for them in the years when they were small, and he was merely their father, and the crown was a future abstraction rather than a present reality. William, who had grown into his role with a steadiness and a seriousness that Charles found genuinely admirable, who was preparing himself for kingship with a dedication that was recognizable and moving. And Harry, who had chosen a different road, not a wrong road, perhaps, from where Harry stood, but a road that now led entirely away from this, from the institution, from the family structure that Charles was responsible for sustaining. He loved them both. He would always love them both. This was not a complicated thing to say or a complicated thing to mean. It was simply a fact about him, one of the unshakable ones. What had become complicated, what would remain complicated, was not the love but the expression of it within a life defined by institutional demands and public responsibilities that did not accommodate love's complexities. What had become complicated was being a father in a context that kept asking him to be, above all other things, a king. He had made his peace with that tension, or so he told himself and largely believed. He had been making peace with versions of that tension for most of his adult life. It was the central negotiation of his existence, the thing that defined his story more than any external event or public role. And he had arrived at a place, through the long discipline of living with it, where the tension was manageable. Where he could hold both things, the father who loved and the king who decided, without being destroyed by the space between them. Camilla watched him come back to himself from wherever he had been, watched the slight return of presence that crossed his face when a person returns from an internal journey. She did not ask where he had been. She knew. She offered instead what she always offered in these moments. Simply herself, present and warm and without agenda, the one person in his life who asked nothing of him in that room, who required nothing from him, who was simply there as herself alongside him being himself. It was, in the end, the oldest and simplest thing. Two people who have chosen each other, sitting together in the weight of something difficult, not solving it or resolving it but sharing it, which is, when you cannot solve or resolve something, the only thing that genuinely helps. The sharing of weight does not make weight disappear, but it changes the nature of carrying it. It makes it somehow more possible. The world outside continued its discussion. The palace continued its operations. The season turned, as seasons do, regardless of the human dramas being conducted within it. The frost softened. The days lengthened imperceptibly. The ground at Sandringham and at the other royal residences began, slowly, to show the first suggestions of spring. Time moved forward because time only moves forward. The monarchy continued because the monarchy was designed to continue through everything. And Charles and Camilla moved forward within it, carrying what they carried, wearing what they wore, performing what needed to be performed, and returning each evening to the private rooms where none of that applied, where they were simply themselves, where the decision was present but not pressing, where the loss was real but not the only real thing. The formal break with Harry, when it was fully documented and processed through all the institutional mechanisms that such things require, did not produce the dramatic public moment that people who watched these things had perhaps expected. The palace does not do drama in the way that drama expects to be done. What happened instead was a gradual clarification, a slow becoming clear of something that had been ambiguous, a settling into permanence of something that had been suspended. Harry remained the Duke of Sussex. He remained the king's son. He remained a person that Charles loved, in the complicated and non-transferable way that a father loves a child who has caused him deep pain, and whom he has also caused deep pain in return, in the way that love persists through rupture, because it is not conditional on resolution. But the working relationship was over. The institutional connection was severed. The thread, the final thread, that had kept Harry formally attached to the structure of the British crown had been cut, cleanly and deliberately, by a king who had concluded that this was what the institution required, and that no amount of personal feeling could responsibly outweigh an institutional necessity that he had been placed on earth to serve. And Camilla lived in the aftermath of that severance in the way she lived in most of the difficult things of her life, by continuing, by not performing grief publicly but not pretending it privately, by being warm to the people around her and effective in her public role and real in the private rooms where being real was possible, by being what she had always been to Charles, the one constant he had not chosen through duty but through the private, irreducible preference of his own heart, and by trusting that this, in the end, was enough, that it was, in fact, the most important thing, that all the institutional machinery and all the formal decisions and all the weight of history and public obligation came back ultimately to this: two people in a private room choosing each other still. The palace held it all, as it had always held everything. History would eventually come for this too, would reduce it, simplify it, argue about it, misunderstand it in the particular ways that history always misunderstands the private interior of the people it documents. Future biographers would write their chapters. Future documentary makers would compile their footage. And somewhere in all of that, the truth of what these two people had actually experienced in these rooms on these days would survive only partially, in fragments, in silences, in the spaces between what was said and what was known, in the irreducible privacy of a real human story that no amount of public attention can ever fully capture. What is left, when all the institutional weight is set aside, and all the public drama has played out, and all the commentary has had its say and gone quiet, is simpler than any of it. A man who had to choose between being a father and being a king chose, as he always chose, the king. And a woman who loved him stood beside that choice, not blindly, not without feeling its full cost, but with the particular fidelity of someone who had committed to standing beside him in the hardest things, and who kept that commitment even when keeping it broke something in her that she would take a long time to repair. And the two of them continued together in the way that people who have been through enough together always continue, not easily, not without weight, but with the deep and abiding certainty that whatever came next, they would carry it, as they had carried everything before it, side by side. The final tie had been broken. The palace stood silent around it, and inside the silence, quietly, the rest of the story went on.